Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Broodcoven for Warhammer 40,000's Genestealer Cult. As you can see, I've sprayed them in 3 different colours. This is going to help speed the process along. The Primus has been sprayed with some standard grey. The Magus has been sprayed with some Sanguine Red. And the Familiar and Patriarch has been sprayed with Macgragge Blue. So beginning with the Magus, I'm going to start by painting the rest of his armour using some Dawnstone. Once that's out of the way, I'm going to give everybody a wash using some Nuln Oil. So that's the Patriarch plus the 2 little Familiars. And for the Magus, it's an all-over wash, but for the Primus, it's just a wash on the visible bits of armour behind his jacket. Once that wash is dried, I'm going to kick things off by using some Abaddon Grey to dry brush the armour on both the Magus and the Primus. Then on the Primus, I'm going to start painting his arms with some Macgragge Blue. I'll then wash those arms using some Nuln Oil. Then while that wash dries, I'm going to break out the Macgragge Blue, and I'm going to dry brush the Patriarch and those little Familiars, taking care to avoid any of the recesses as we start to lighten the colour. I'll then follow that up by a 50-50 mix of Macgragge Blue and Calgar Blue for a second dry brush. And then finally Calgar Blue just by itself as a much lighter final dry brush. This one's designed just to pick out the more finer details and edges. By now the wash on the arm should have dried, so I'm basically going to repeat that process, but this time I'm going to paint on rather than dry brushing on. Then staying with the Primus, I'm going to paint his jacket with some Abaddon Black, and I'll paint any other details with Abaddon Black, such as the strings on the Magus. And I'll also paint the fingers and the claws on everybody. Then any holsters or pouches I find, I'm going to paint with some Catachan Flesh. This includes belts as well. Any silver I'll paint with Leadblecher. That's basically the weapons and the staff, not the full staff though, of the Magus, and the sewer pipe that our Patriarch is sitting on. I'm then going to paint the cloth on the Familiars with some Mephiston Red, and I'm also going to use that Mephiston Red to pick out a couple of the helmets that are on the Patriarch. I also painted the inside of the Primus's jacket. I'm then going to wash the sewer pipe using some Agrax Earthshade. And then everything else we've painted from the Abaddon Black using some Nuln Oil. While that wash dries, I'm going to paint the other Space Marine helmet that the Familiar is standing on. I'm going to go with an Imperial Fist helmet, so I'll be using some Averland Sunset. I'm also going to use it to paint the light on the Primus, and then I'll wash that with some Agrax Earthshade. As the wash still dries, I'm going to get the tongues out of the way using a little bit of Screamer Pink, and I'm also going to paint the gems that are on the Magus and the weapon of the Primus. Then I'm going to wash that Screamer Pink with a little bit of Carroburg Crimson. Then going back to painting the Abaddon Black, I'll start the highlighting process using a 50-50 mix of Abaddon Black and Mechanicus Standard Grey. This will then be followed by an edge highlight of Mechanicus Standard Grey just by itself. Then to highlight all the metal, I'll use a 50-50 mix of Leadblecher and Stormhost Silver. Then moving back to the pouches, I'll start the highlighting process by using a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and Knight's Questor Flesh. Followed by an edge highlight of Knight's Questor Flesh just by itself. Then I'm going to move back to the red, and I'll start by relayering the Mephiston Red, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. Then I'll highlight that using a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Wild Rider Red. And then I'll be using Wild Rider Red just by itself as an edge highlight. Then I'll be painting any gold details using some Retributor Armour. Don't forget to look for the ones that are on the base of the Patriarch. There are a couple dotted around, mixed in with the skulls at the bottom. I'll then wash that gold using some Reikland Fleshshade. While that wash dries, we'll go back to the Screamer Pink, and I'll highlight that using a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. Obviously, this is for the tongues. When it comes to the gems, though, aim for the base of the gem itself and try to do it in a tiny little swooping motion. I'll then follow that up with a little dot of Pink Horror just by itself, aimed towards the bottom of the gems. Then I'm going to use a tiny dot of matte white just to place it in the top corner, or one of the corners, as much as the corners you can get with a gem, to look like reflecting light. Moving on to highlighting the yellow, I'll start by relayering the Averland Sunset, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And then I'll highlight that using a 50-50 mix of Averland Sunset and Uriel Yellow. Next, I'm going to use Wraithbone to paint all of the skin, and I'm also going to use it to paint the skulls and the goopy stuff that's on the rest of the base of the Patriarch. Then, starting with the skulls, I'm going to wash those using some Agrax Earthshade. And then for the skin, I'll wash that using some Carroburg Crimson. And as that wash dries, I'll go in and highlight the gold using a 50-50 mix of Retributor Armour and Stormhost Silver. Around the Magus, there's a few vials, so I'm going to paint those using a little bit of Caliban Green. I'll also paint the eyes of the Space Marine helmet, and then I'll give that a highlight with a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Orruk Flesh. Then for the goop that's on the Patriarch's base, I'm going to use a little bit of Coelia Greenshade. I'll probably give this a second coat just to make it a little bit thicker. Then to highlight the skulls, I'm simply just going to relayer the Wraithbone, taking care to avoid any recesses. I'm going to make sure it's a little bit thinned down so some of the shading shines through. Before I start working on this skin, I'm going to get the eyes out of the way, so I'll use some Abaddon Black. And then for the Magus and the Primus, I'll use a little bit of matte white. And don't forget to use that matte white to paint any teeth as well. Then for the two familiars and the Broodlord, or Patriarch, sorry, I will use a little bit of Averland Sunset. I'll then start highlighting the skin using a 50-50 mix of Carroburg Crimson and Wraithbone. And then I'll use that same mix, this time at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Wraithbone, and this is for the more sort of predominant areas such as knuckles and some of the details on the skin, like cheekbones and noses. I also want that brain on the Patriarch to be a little bit deeper in the red, so I'm just going to relayer the Carroburg Crimson just one more time. For the Primus, he's got a red tube coming out of his nose, and I'm going to paint that exactly the same way as I painted the rest of the red. Then at the bottom of the Patriarch's base, I'm going to paint all of those rocky areas with some Mechanicus Standard Grey. And then I'll cover the rest of the bases using some Astrogranite. But it's entirely up to you how you base your miniatures. Once your Astrogranite has dried, I'm going to be giving it a quick dry brush using a tiny bit of Wraithbone. And then finally, I'll be using some Abaddon Black just to neaten up all of those rims. And there we are, that's all of the Broodcoven finished. I have to say, they are fun models to paint, but I've painted enough of them in my time to be kind of tired of painting them. But if this is your first time, you definitely will have a blast. They don't take too long either whatsoever, only coming in roughly about 4-5 hours for all of them. Getting the right spray to kick things off is definitely vital, as obviously it makes the process of painting them a whole lot faster than you can possibly imagine, and you'll soon be zooming along. If you follow this guide, I really do hope you found it useful, and if you want to see more, there's plenty more guides on the channel for 40k, sort of Marvel Crisis Protocol, all sorts of stuff. Thanks again, bye for now.